Hi, and welcome to Clutter With. This is Joan, and today I'm going to share with you how I turned a sewing room from this to this. As with all of my clients, I started with a free at-home consultation. During a free consultation, I try to understand the blockers that she has with the current layout of the space. The main problem was she no longer felt joy when going into the sewing room because she felt overwhelmed by the amount of objects that she had on top of the cutting table and on top of her sewing table. As you can see from the pictures, there were also multiple objects obstructing the path, literally acting as tripping hazards for both herself and her husband. He is in a wheelchair, and some of the objects that were obstructing the way would not let him enter the sewing room. But actually, this was not the biggest challenge that I had when entering the sewing room.
Clutter comes and goes with a bit of time and within the comfort level of the owner. That's something that I can always manage. So honestly, I wasn't too concerned about that. What really stood out as a challenge was the layout of the room. As you can see, there were already two large pieces of furniture, a cutting table and a sewing table, positioned somewhat in the center of the room to give the owner more space to move around.
The owner mentioned that she had a second sewing table that she wanted to fit into the room, and the only option that she had used in the past was placing the table next to the door. But as you can see from here, the sewing table next to the door would obstruct maybe half of the entryway, and while she could still enter the sewing room, her husband in a wheelchair could definitely not do it.
At that point, it was clear. If we wanted the room to be functional and comfortable, we'd have to rethink how everything was arranged. I started experimenting with different furniture placements. I narrowed it down to my top 3 options and walked her through each one. Together we picked a layout that felt right for her, then made a few small tweaks to fine-tune it into the best possible layout.
So then we started the actual organizing of the space. Number 1 was to remove all the objects from the room. We took everything out from on top of the tables, in the shelves, in the drawers, in the closet, from the floor, and we put them in a separate room. Number 2, we repositioned the furniture. So we brought the table from the living room, we placed it into the sewing room, we moved the cutting table and the sewing tables, and we positioned them to the desired layout. Number 3, we sorted through all of the items and we created macro categories for trash, donations, items that we keep but that belong in another room of the house, and items that we are going to keep inside the room. Number 4, we created categories for all of the items that we kept in the room. We had large categories like documents, paper, books, cables, active projects. So we sorted that into categories and we came up with a logical home for everything. For example, the right side of the cutting table we used to store small objects that could fit into the drawers, but that was also useful for the sewing table. So every time the owner would sit at the table, she could easily reach for a drawer and grab something, either a pin or buttons or other things that she could use during the sewing process. Another example is her closet. We repurposed this to hold all of her active projects that we sorted into smaller categories. Everything you see on the shelf are active projects and smaller pieces that will fit into a bigger project at some point. The closet also is now home for various tools that she doesn't use as frequently as the tools that she has next to her sewing table. Regarding the second table, you can see that there is a lot of space in between that and the door. That is the table that the husband is going to use for the sewing project. And you can see that there's pretty much a straight line from the entry to the sewing table, so he doesn't have to swerve around objects to get to the table. And I think that was the most rewarding for me and for this project. The fact that we managed to fit the second table and we also create this wide space into the room and make sure a wheelchair can easily access the table. You can also see a bin next to the table that is specifically left there for catching completed projects. So after the husband will finish sewing the project, he will just drop the items in that bin next to the table. So from a user experience perspective, this workflow really works for the owners. Number 5, I deep cleaned the place. No matter how organized a space is, if you have stains on the shelves and inside the drawers, it just kind of kills some of the joy. When you open a drawer and it's nicely organized, but there are crumbs in the corner or under the items you have, there's something about it. So I made sure that everything was absolutely clean and dust free and stain free before placing everything there. So everything was left nice and clean and organized. The owner was truly happy with the result. Now I do have to give a huge kudos to my client. She was an absolute pleasure and joy to work with. She had no trouble in letting go of the items and donations, and I did take about 4 carloads of donations from the place. She was also very hands-on and involved, and I actually liked that part because it ensured that at the end of the projects there were no retouches of where items should go. And I do like to know that there's truly a happy customer at the end of a project. Thank you for watching.